Thanks for stopping by to check out another episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the Bryston 2B-LP Power Amplifier. Bryston sold these between 1996 and 1997 for $850 US. Bryston is a Canadian company. And that would equate to $1,600 according to the handy-dandy inflation calculator. The unit is pretty simple from the front. It has a power on off switch and two LEDs that turn green when it is powered on. I also like the fact that they mounted their heat sinks here and here. This is a dual monoblock design in that each amplifier has its own power supply. The Bryston 2B-LP is rated at 60 watts per channel into 8 ohms from 20 Hz to 20 kHz at 0.01% THD or better, and 100 watts into 4 ohms from 20 Hz to 20 kHz at 0.01% THD. It's also bridgeable into a monoblock where it is rated at 200 watts into 8 ohms. I should also point out that the Bryston 2B-LP is a fairly solid unit. It weighs 18 pounds, so it's heavier than it looks like. It does have a nice grounded power cord, which is probably 6 feet long, and it just seems like it exudes quality. Just looking at it, just from what I've seen, it just seems to be a very nicely built unit. This obviously is the rear of the Bryston 2B-LP. Now both of the RCA jacks are gold plated. You also have a switch right here for switching it to stereo mono, and you do have your three-way banana jacks. So if you're going to use this as a monoblock, you would connect your left and right speakers to these two red terminals. So it does have a chassis ground removal switch. If for some reason you're getting some ground hum, you can try moving that switch into another position and hopefully the hum would go away. Here is the Bryston 2B-LP with the cover removed, and it's pretty apparent that it is made up of two independent channels, each with their own power supply. You can see the toroidal transformers for each power supply. Also, the great thing I like about the Bryston is that it has connectors here and here for each of the circuit boards, which makes for really easy service. You just have to remove a few screws on the front, and then the board will just slide out and you can get to the components fairly easily. I really like the way that they did that. A few other things to point out are that they even labeled in some cases what transistors are in each place, and the components that they use seem to be high quality. From this view you can tell that the output transistors are up front, which explains why they have the heat sinks on the front of the case. Also, there is a thermal protection circuit breaker here and here. So overall, I really like the design that Bryston used, and it's very low profile as well. Here we have our standard 5 watt into 8 ohm condition, and we can see that the right channel's SNR is not nearly as good as the left channel's, which is excellent, and both are exhibiting really good THDs, and the gain of the amplifier is right at 29 dB. So overall, it's looking fairly decent. Here we have the frequency response of the Bryston, and this is where it is putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and the response is only down about 0.4 of a dB at 20 kilohertz, and the channels are extremely well matched. So this is looking really, really good. Here we have the multi-tone response of the Bryston 2B-LP, and it has anywhere from 13 to 15 bits of distortion-free range. The right channel not quite as good as the left channel in certain points. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kHz with the Bryston putting out 60 watts into 8 ohm loads, both channels driven, and we can see that we are beating the 0.01% THD requirement for that power level. And the SNRs are looking really well, as are the THD plus noise. So overall, this Bryston is doing a pretty good job of meeting its requirements. Here we have a plot showing the THD versus frequency for a couple different power levels with the Bryston operating into 8 ohm load. And you can see that for the left channel, it pretty much meets its 0.01% THD requirement from about 200 Hertz on up, whereas for the right channel, it doesn't look as good around 20 Hertz down to about 200 Hertz. But the worst case for the right channel would be about 0.4% or so, which is still not too bad. Here is a plot showing the output impedance of the Bryston. There actually is a requirement for the damping factor, which was greater than 500 at 20 Hertz, referencing an 8 ohm load. If you take 1 over the impedance at 20 Hertz and multiply that by 8 ohms, you would come up with about 94, and that is quite a bit short than the 500 specification. However, 94 is still pretty darn reasonable. Here we have the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for the Bryston, putting out 5 watts into 4 ohm loads, and it looks fairly similar to the 8 ohm 5 watt case, with the right channel performing worse than the left channel. However, the THD for both channels is still pretty good. And here we have the frequency response of the Bryston looking into 4 ohm loads with a 5 watt output, and it looks pretty much like the 8 ohm load case, down maybe 0.5 of a dB at 20 kilohertz. Here we have the THD SNR plot with the Bryston putting out 100 watts into 4 ohm loads, and it is meeting the 0.01% THD requirement, and the SNR is still looking better for the left channel than the right channel, but all in all, the amplifier is performing pretty good into 4 ohms. This plot shows the crosstalk between the left and right channels. In this case, the right channel is terminated into a short, and the left channel has a signal applied, and you are looking at the amount of leakage from the left channel on into the right channel. Basically, the isolation or crosstalk is better than 60 dB. There is a peak at 60 Hertz, which is from the power supply. I also tested the left channel, and it did not show nearly as big a peak at 60 Hertz as did the right channel, but we'll just say the isolation is better than 60 dB. Here we have the Bryston acting as a mono block amplifier, putting out 5 watts into 8 ohms, and you can see that it looks really good. What we are looking at here is the frequency response of the Bryston running as a mono amp into 8 ohms with a 5 watt output. And this behavior is not something that I saw when it was running as a stereo amp. And what is happening is the level is changing by as much as a dB or so as you're watching it. It should be basically a flat line now. That peak is at 60 Hertz, and that is kind of normal. That thing will come and go, but the whole frequency response shouldn't move like it is doing. Here we have the Bryston 2B-LP operating as a monoblock amp, putting out 202 watts into an 8 ohm load with an SNR of 90, we'll call it 100 dB. And the THD will round it down so it's 0.01%, which is meeting the amplifier specification. It's also worth noting that the amplifier has 35 dB of gain as a monoblock amp. And the last piece of data I have for the Bryston 2B-LP is the amplifier operating as a monoblock amp into 8 ohms once again. And here I pushed it so it was putting out 240 watts. You can see that the THD plus noise has gone down to about 75 dB. And the THD is still looking 0.014%. That's really good. And the SNR is still really good. So this amplifier is doing an outstanding job working as a mono block amp beyond its specification. As you saw from the data, the Bryston 2B-LP did a pretty good job against its nearly 27-year-old specifications. I thought it worked really well as an 8 ohm monoblock amplifier. Unfortunately, I did not test it as a 4 ohm monoblock amplifier, but based on its stereo performance into 4 ohm loads, I'm thinking it would probably have done a good job. For my listening test, I hooked the Bryston up to my Klipsch La Scala loudspeakers with my Carver C1 preamp, and the unit sounded really good. The nice thing about the La Scalas is you don't require much power, and I was hitting 97 dB SPLs in the room where I have my La Scalas, which is smaller than the room where the Kefs are. It was extremely loud. It was louder than I would normally want to listen to, and I was only using about 10 watts from the Bryston. So if you have some really good efficient speakers in a decent sized room, an average sized room, I think this room is maybe 13 by 8 by 14, it really was all that that room needed with those speakers. It sounded just fine. It did not get hot. I measured the heat sinks at one point and they were at 97 degrees F, which is really pretty cool for amplifiers that I measured. Before I started testing, I terminated both the inputs into the Bryston into shorts and listened for hum out of the La Scalas, and the left channel gave me just a small amount of hiss out of the tweeter. There was absolutely nothing out of the right channel, which is surprising because the right channel had a bit of hum. In the data you saw 60 Hertz and its harmonics, giving the right channel a worse THD plus. However, the 60 Hertz noise spikes are down there pretty low, but this unit probably could use a capacitor replacement in the power supply, or possibly one of the capacitors on the rails going to the output transistors may be needing replacement. But that isn't anything that I heard. I didn't really hear any noise while listening at all. So overall, I think the Bryston 2B-LP, the LP I think means low profile, is a nice amp. If you had two of these and used them as a bridged mono amp, I think it would be really, really nice. And in my case, for real efficient speakers, this would be all that you might need to drive them at a very decent level. So that is my take on the Bryston 2B-LP. I have seen these on eBay for between $4.99 and $9.99 for used ones, and it may not be a bad amplifier for your system. I would like to thank my audiophile friend Richard for loaning this to me to test, and once again, if you have not subscribed, please do so, and if you have any comments on this video, please leave them in the area for comments. And until next time, have a great day or night.